In this video, I will show you how to graph cosine and sine functions that have a change in amplitude, a change in period, a phase shift, and a vertical shift. So, first of all, really before I do anything, I would like to rewrite this equation in a slightly different form. So I'm focusing on the part where it says 1/3 x plus pi over 6. We need to factor the 1/3 outside of parentheses. So in order to figure out what goes inside the parentheses, we need to divide everything by 1/3. So of course these will cancel out, which will just leave x. But to do pi over 6 divided by 1/3, you have to multiply by the reciprocal. So this will be the same thing as pi over 6 times 3 over 1. So that is 3 pi over 6, which reduces down to pi over 2. So this will really be 1/3 times parentheses x plus pi over 2. So if I rewrite this whole equation, I really have y equals 2 cosine 1/3 parentheses x plus pi over 2 plus 2. So this is the version of the equation that I'm going to use for the rest of the problem. Alright, so the period is given by the a value here. No, that's false. The period is 2 pi over the b value. The b value in this case is 1/3. So that means the period is going to be 2 pi divided by 1/3. And again, when you divide by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. So the period is going to be 6 pi. The midline comes from this k value, this plus 2 being added on the end. That's a vertical shift, so the new midline will be y equals 2, which is coming straight from that. Now the amplitude is coming from the a value. So the amplitude will be 2. Please notice that the amplitude is always positive. Even if this were a -2, the amplitude would still be positive 2. Now the phase shift is the main reason why we factored the 1/3 outside of parentheses. Alright, the phase shift is going to come from this h value right here. See the pi over 2? So the phase shift will be negative pi over 2. Alright, it's just going to be the opposite of whatever this is. So now we are ready to graph. Now the phase shift is arguably the most important part because your first mark needs to go at the phase shift. So I'm going to put my first mark at negative pi over 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and just put 4 additional marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. So because I made 4 spaces, each space represents a quarter of the period. So let's calculate what that is. Alright, I'm using QP for a quarter period. Since the period is 6 pi, the quarter period will be 6 pi divided by 4, which reduces down to 3 pi over 2. So to get the next x value, I need to take the first x value and add the quarter period. So I need to take negative pi over 2 and I need to add 3 pi over 2. Alright, so that's going to give me 2 pi over 2. I'll reduce that in a moment. But to get the next mark, I need to add another 3 pi over 2. So that would be 5 pi over 2. If I add another 3 pi over 2, that would be 8 pi over 2. And if I add another 3 pi over 2, that would be 11 pi over 2. So these are my x values. I'm just going to reduce as needed. So 2 pi over 2 reduces to pi. 5 pi over 2 does not reduce. 8 pi over 2 is 4 pi. And 11 pi over 2 does not reduce. Okay. Now, there is a vertical shift. All right, let me pause and clean this up a bit. I better go ahead and throw the y-axis in here. So the y-axis is going to be somewhere between this negative and this positive. Please understand that this y-axis is not one of the 5 values. All right, we already have our 5 marks. So when I'm putting the 5 key points on the graph, I will not use the y-axis. I'll skip right over that. I'm only putting the y-axis down so I can show the midline is at 2. So I'm going to go 1, 2. So here's the midline. Now the amplitude is 2. So if I go up 2 from here, that should be the highest point, which is 4. And if I go down 2 from here, that should be the lowest point, which is the x-axis. So now I can do the graph. So cosine functions start off at the highest value. Wait, for the midline, we need to put a dotted line at the midline. So let's put a dotted line straight through here. All right, this is the midline. All right, this is mandatory. Okay, so anyway, the cosine function starts off at its highest point. So it's going to start off at 4. And then it's going to just do the wave that it always does. So it's going to fall to the midline, and then lowest point, and then back to the midline, and then highest point. Do not make this like a V. Don't do that. Instead, you're going to make it nice and curvy. Like that. All right, see how it sort of flattens out at the top? That's because if I kept going, it would go like back down again. All right, anyway, there is one period of the function. Problem number 7 is done. So for problem number 8, again, I'm going to start by focusing on this part, which I need to rewrite. So right now I have 4x minus pi, but I need to take that 4 outside of parentheses. In order to do that, I'm going to divide everything by 4. So that's going to give me x minus pi over 4. So the equation I'm really working with is y equals -3 sine 4 parentheses x minus pi over 4 and minus 1. So this is the version of the equation I'm going to look at. All right, the period. We know that the period is 2 pi divided by the b value. So in this case, the b value is 4. So that means the period is going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which means the period is pi over 2. Okay, so the period is pi over 2. The midline is going to be y equals -1 because of the -1 on the end. Don't forget the y equals part. It's the equation of a horizontal line. The amplitude is going to be 3 because of this a value in the front. But the amplitude is always positive, so don't put -3. The phase shift is the main reason why I had to factor this 4 outside of parentheses. The phase shift is pi over 4. All right, not pi, which is what it looked like at first. Pi over 4. Notice that it is the opposite sign. So because I had minus pi over 4, the phase shift is positive pi over 4. All right, the phase shift is the most important part because it tells you where to put your first mark, where to begin the graph. So I'm going to go ahead and put a mark right here. I'm leaving a little space because I know the y-axis will be somewhere to the left, so I'm leaving room for it. But my first mark will go at the phase shift, at pi over 4. Okay, and then I'm going to go over 4 spaces. So because I made 4 spaces, each space is a quarter of a period. So let's figure out what a quarter of a period actually is. So the period is pi over 2. So that means a quarter of the period should be pi over 2 divided by 4. Now, an easy way to divide a fraction by an extra number is just to take that number and put it in the denominator. So this would be the same thing as pi over 2 times 4. See how the 4 just got up into the denominator? Okay, so that tells me that the quarter period will be pi over 8. Now, so to get the next x value, I need to add a quarter of a period, and that should give me the next x value. So in other words, I'm starting with pi over 4. And I'm adding pi over 8. I'm adding a quarter of a period. We need like denominators, so we would multiply by 2 here. So that'll give us 2 pi over 8 plus pi over 8. And that's going to be 3 pi over 8. So that'll be the next value. But let's keep going. If I add another pi over 8, that would be 4 pi over 8. If I add another pi over 8, that would be 5 pi over 8. And then 6 pi over 8. Running out of space here. 6 pi over 8. Some of these reduce. 3 pi over 8 does not reduce, so I'll just keep that the same. 3 pi over 8. 4 pi over 8 is actually pi over 2. 5 pi over 8 does not reduce. 6 pi over 8 is 3 pi over 4. Alright, so those are the x values that I'm going to need. I need to see exactly where the y-axis goes, so I'm going to put some extra values on here. So I'm going to put another mark going to the left here. I'm shooting for a negative number, so I'll know that the y-axis belongs. So instead of adding pi over 8, I'm going to start subtracting pi over 8. So imagine that I did minus pi over 8. Okay, so that 2 pi over 8 minus pi over 8 would be pi over 8. That's still positive, so I need to subtract again. So if I subtract another pi over 8, well, that would just be 0. So, okay, so I'm going to have to add 2 marks on here. Alright, so the first mark over would be pi over 8. And then the next mark would be 0. So since this next mark is 0, that is where the y-axis actually goes. So I'm going to erase all this stuff and put the y-axis back in. Alright, so here's my y-axis. So the midline is at -1. So I'm going to go ahead and go down 1. Alright, so here's my midline. So I really need to squeeze a dotted line in here. It kind of bugs me that it's going through my numbers. But what are you going to do? Got to do what you got to do. Now, the amplitude is 3. So I need to go up 3. So 1, 2, 3. So that's going to be positive 2. And I need to go down 3. So this is -4 right here. So these three values have to be on your y-axis. All right, your high, your midline, and your low. So now we can go ahead and do the function. All right, I think for fun, I'm going to put some extra lines on here just to help me. Okay, to help me graph a little bit better. No, I won't. All right, so the sine function starts at the midline. Remember, the phase shift is pi over 4. So we're going to start our first dot at the midline at the phase shift, pi over 4. Now normally the sine function goes up and down and back like this. However, see that negative sign in the front? That means there's a reflection over the x-axis. For that reason, instead of going up, it's going to go down to its lowest point. And then it will come back. And then it will go up to its highest point. And then back. So your sine function should look like this. Alright, that's it for problem number 8. For problem number 9, let's start by fixing this part that's inside the parentheses. So, first of all, this x over 2. Understand that this is the same thing as having 1/2 x plus pi over 5. Alright, x over 2 is the same thing as 1/2 x. Now, I need to take that 1/2 outside of parentheses. And to do that, I'm going to simply divide everything by 1/2. So that will leave me with x plus, so pi over 5 divided by 1/2, that's going to be the same thing as pi over 5 times 2 over 1, because you got to multiply by the reciprocal. So that's going to be 2 pi over 5. So that's what goes right here, 2 pi over 5. So my new version of this equation, if I can just make a little space, is going to be y equals 1/2 cosine parentheses 1/2 parentheses x plus 2 pi over 5. And then minus 3. So this is the version of the equation that I'm going to use for the rest of the problem. Alright, really the only thing I changed was the inside of the parentheses. Okay, but that will help me see some key things. Now the period, we know that the period is always 2 pi divided by the b value. So in this case, the b value is 1/2. So it's going to be 2 pi divided by 1/2. But you multiply by the reciprocal. So that'll be 2 pi times 2. That's why the period is going to be 4 pi. The midline is just this number on the end. So it's going to be y equals -3. Don't forget the y equals part. The amplitude is 1/2. So let's go ahead and put 1/2 for the amplitude. Now the phase shift is going to come from this number that we got after we factored the 1/2 outside the parentheses. It will be the opposite sign, so I'm going to put -2 pi over 5. That is the phase shift. So let me just clean up my space here. And let's get the graph started. So your first mark should go at the phase shift. So my first mark will be -2 pi over 5. And then I'm going to need 4 additional marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I made 4 marks, each jump is a quarter of the period. So let's figure out what a quarter of the period would be. since the period is 4 pi, then a quarter of the period would simply be 4 pi divided by 4, which is pi. So I need to take my first number, negative 2 pi over 5, and I need to add pi to it. All right, that should give me the next x value. But I need like denominators, so this is the same thing as having 5 pi over 5. So if I add these together, that's going to be 3 pi over 5. So that's the next value. So to get the next value, I need to add another 5 pi over 5. So that would be 8 pi over 5. And then another 5 pi over 5 would be 13 pi over 5. And then another 5 pi over 5 would be 18 pi over 5. Okay, so I'm just going to write these on the line. None of these reduce. So 3 pi over 5, 8 pi over 5, 13 pi over 5, and 18 pi over 5. Okay, great. I'm just going to erase all that. All right, can you guys hear that noise in the background? It sounds like a blender. I wonder if someone's making a smoothie. Okay, the y-axis has to go somewhere between the negative and the positive. So I'm just going to put my y-axis in here somewhere. Okay, there's a vertical shift of down 3, so my midline is going to be like this. 1, 2, 3. So here at negative 3, there's my midline. I'm going to need a dotted line to represent the midline. Okay, now the amplitude is 1/2. Interesting. So because the amplitude is 1/2, I'm going to end up coming up like a half of a mark and down half of a mark. Okay, so like, all right, so this is -2 and this is -4. So just understand, I'm just going to be going above and below this like a tiny bit. Okay, so let's see, this is a cosine function. So it should start at its highest value. So starting at the phase shift, okay, it's the highest value is going to be right here, half a unit above the midline. And then there will be no marks on the y-axis. But then we are at the midline. And then we are below the midline. Okay, but not all the way down to here. All right, just a tiny bit. And then we're back to the midline again. And then we're above the midline. So this is a very shallow graph. That's so shallow, it's difficult to draw. Okay, I feel like I gotta try to do slightly better than that. Alright, this is hard to do with an electronic pen, it turns out. Okay, I'm gonna have to give up. You get the idea. Alright, that's pretty good. Alright, let's do one more of these beauties. Again, first we have to fix this part of the equation. So I have this 2x minus pi, but I need to take the 2 outside of parentheses. And to do that, I'm going to divide everything by 2. So that's going to give me x minus pi over 2. So this equation will become y equals 4 sine, and then 2 parentheses x minus pi over 2, and then plus 1. So this is the version of the equation that I will be using for the rest of the problem. So the period. We know that the period is going to be 2 pi divided by the b value. So in this case, that'll be 2 pi divided by 2, because the b value is 2. So that tells me that the period is pi. Okay, so let's go ahead and write that down. The period is pi. Okay, now the midline is going to come from this number being added on the end. So I'm going to put y equals 1 for the midline. The amplitude is going to come from the number in the front. The amplitude is 4. Notice that the amplitude is always positive, so even if this was a negative 4, I would still put positive 4. The phase shift is going to come from this number inside the parentheses. The phase shift will be pi over 2. Notice it is the opposite of what you see here. So minus pi over 2 means that the phase shift is actually positive pi over 2. Alright, so let's erase this stuff and start graphing. The phase shift is the most important part of the graph, because the phase shift is where we will graph the first point of the period. So the first mark you should put on your x-axis is the phase shift. So that is pi over 2. And then go ahead and put down 4 additional marks. Because I put 4 marks, each jump represents a quarter of the period. So let's figure out what a quarter of the period is, so we can just add it to get from point to point. Well, this is going to be pretty simple. Since the period is pi, then the quarter period should simply be pi divided by 4. So pi over 4. So I need to take the first value, the pi over 2, and I need to add pi over 4. I'm adding a quarter of the period, so that will tell me what the next x value is. But I need like denominators, so this is really 2 pi over 4 plus pi over 4. So that's going to give me 3 pi over 4. Okay, so that'll be the next value. But the next value, I need another quarter of a period, so I'm going to add another pi over 4. So that'll be 4 pi over 4. Whoops, 4 pi over 4. And then 5 pi over 4. And then 6 pi over 4. All right, I'm just adding this quarter of a period again and again and again. So I'm going to just go ahead and record these on my graph, but I'll reduce anything that can reduce. So first I have 3 pi over 4. But then 4 pi over 4 is just pi. And then 5 pi over 4. But then 6 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 2. Okay, you must reduce. Now I need an extra value or two going to the left. I need to locate the y-axis. And I'll know it when I get to a negative number. So instead of adding pi over 4, I will now subtract pi over 4. Okay, so, well, you know what, I should be looking at this. Subtract pi over 4. So if I have 2 pi over 4 minus pi over 4, that's pi over 4. All right, so that means this mark right here is pi over 4. So I actually need to keep going further. Okay, so if I subtract another pi over 4, that will be 0. So that means this mark will actually be the y-axis. So right here I have pi over 4, And here where I would have 0, that's going to be the y-axis. Okay, so we have this vertical shift up 1. So here's my 1, and we need our dotted line representing the midline. This is mandatory. You may not skip it. Now, the amplitude is 4. So I need to go up 4 from here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is 5. I need to go down 4 from here. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is -3. Okay, so this is a sine function, and we've memorized that the sine function starts off at the midline. Remember, we're starting at the phase shift though, so don't start all the way over here at the y-axis. We're starting at the phase shift, which was pi over 2. Okay, so start off at the midline, and then the sine function goes up and down and back. So at the next quarter period, it's going to be at the highest value, and then back to the midline. And then at the next quarter period, it should be at its lowest value, and then back to the midline. So this sine function is going to look something like this. All right, and that is it for number 10. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and click here in the red apple to watch the next video. Click in the green apple to subscribe, or click the yellow apple for the full playlist.